So I think I'm starting to realize personality might be way less personal than people think, right? Which sounds insane. I understand that because obviously people have personalities, people have preferences, people have opinions, people have things they genuinely like. I get it, you know? But I don't know. Sometimes I think people confuse familiarity with identity, like something gets repeated long enough and eventually it starts introducing itself as you know? And that's kind of terrifying, right? Because I think about how people describe themselves, They say things like I'm a gym person. I'm introverted, I'm ambitious, I'm laid back. I'm just an anxious person. Okay, maybe, right? But when did it happen? Like genuinely, did when did that become true? Because I don't think most identities arrive dramatically. I think they arrive quietly, one repetition at a time, Then one day you look up and call the result your personality. That's the part I keep getting stuck on, because repetition is sneaky, nobody notices repetition. People notice transformations, people notice before and after photos. People notice the weight loss. People notice the career changes. People notice, nobody notices the 600 ordinary Tuesday that caused them, though, right? You know what I mean? Like somebody starts going to the gym, nothing happens. Week one, nothing. Week two, nothing. Still the same person, still looking in the mirror, still feeling themselves, Then 6 months later, they miss a workout and feel weird all day. Now, suddenly, they're saying fitness changed their life. And maybe it did because not not because of motivation, not because of discipline, because repetition slowly convinced them they were the type of person who shows up. That's different. The workout wasn't the transformation, the repetition was. That's probably the whole thing. People think repetition reflects identity. I think repetition creates identity. That's a completely different conversation because if that's true, then a lot of what we call personality might just be accumulated behavior, right? It just might be accumulated behavior, right? And that's uncomfortable because now we have to ask a different question. Not who am I, but what am I repeatedly becoming? Because those are not the same thing. And honestly, you can see this behavior everywhere, right? Music is a weird example, Nobody talks about music like this. People treat music like it's some deep expression of who they are, like it came directly from the soul. But I don't know. I've watched people's entire playlist change because of one roommate, one relationship, one friend group, that's it. 6 months later, they're posting songs they would have skipped immediately a year ago. Now they're talking about the music fits their energy. But does it? Maybe, right? But maybe you've just heard it every day for 8 months. And that's where it gets weird, right? Because repetition slowly turns exposure into preference, preference into comfort, comfort into identity. Now you're saying this is just my music taste. And maybe it is, but repetition helped build that, way more than people would like to admit. Language might be even a stranger, right? You ever spend enough time around a specific friend group, not even in a fake way, You genuinely start talking different, different vocabulary, different jokes, different reactions, different rhythm. At first, you're borrowing phrases, then eventually, they're yours. Now, somebody from 5 years ago wouldn't even recognize how you even spoke, right? And nobody notices it because it feels natural. That's the trick. Repetition always feels natural once it's finished. Nobody feels themselves changing. They only notice they only notice the person that showed up afterward. And that's the kind of part that's the part I can't stop thinking about, right? If repetition can change how you talk and repetition can change how you want to listen or what you listen to, what else is it changing that we're calling our personality? And I think that's where things start getting uncomfortable. I think the scariest example is probably your phone because not because phones are evil, it's not villainous to have a phone, right? Before somebody says, so what, we should just throw away our phones. No, come on now, relax. That's not what I'm saying, right? I'm talking about repetition because repetition doesn't care if something is good or bad. It only cares if it happens. And doom scrolling might be the cleanest example of that. You ever spend an hour just scrolling and then sit in silence? Nothing feels wrong, but but nothing feels wrong, but something feels wrong, right? You know what I mean? Like you put your phone down, pick it back up, open Instagram, close Instagram, open YouTube, close YouTube, walk to the kitchen, open the fridge, look around, close it, then come back 10 minutes later, like the refrigerator got a software update. Like, brother, the ketchup is still there, nothing changed. But your baseline changed, right? That's different because people think doom scrolling affects attention and it does, right? But I think it affects mood more. That's the part nobody really discuss. You spend enough time consuming outrage, drama, arguments, people showing off, people pretending, people collapsing, people succeeding, people failing, all day, every day. Eventually, your emotional baseline starts moving, not dramatically, no, not drastically, but quietly, That's the thing. Nobody wakes up and says, I'd like to become more cynical today, right? Nobody just decides that. It just accumulates, one scroll, and then another, and then another, right? Until eventually your brain starts expecting simulation every 15 seconds. Now stillness feels broken. And because stillness feels broken, you assume you are, that's nasty work, right? Because the repetition changed the feeling. Then the feeling got mistaken to for identity. Now somebody says, I'm just an impatient person. But are you? Right? Or did you spend the 4 years training your nervous system to be impatient and not be able to wait for the next thing to happen? Those are different conversations. I think friend groups do this too, maybe even more. You ever notice how different versions of yourself come out around different people? Not fake versions, That's not what I mean. I'm talking about real versions, You you get around one of the group and suddenly you're hilarious. Now you got jokes. Now you're a comedian, right? Jokes are landing, stories are flowing, everything feels natural. But then you get around another group and You're quiet all night. Now you're driving home wondering, am I actually introverted? And maybe, or maybe one environment keeps rehearsing a different version of you, because that's what repetition does. It rehearses. That's the word I've been looking for, right? Rehearse. It rehearses like a play, right? You do something enough times and eventually it doesn't feel performed anymore. It feels authentic. That's why language changes so fast. You spend 6 months around a certain group and suddenly you're using phrases you never would have touched before, right? Like the cadence changes, the slang changes, the jokes change, right? Your personality starts sounding different. And the funny thing is nobody notices it's happening. The only you only notice afterward, like looking at older messages, that's always weird. Go read text from 5 years ago and see how disturbing the experience is, right? I'm serious. Do that now. Pause this video and look at your text, right? You start reading and thinking like whose man's is this? Who is this person, right? Like, why am I talking like that? Why am I saying that? Right? Like, why do all my jokes sound different? Right? Because repetition built something. And that's kind of the uncomfortable realization. People think identity is a stable thing. It's this stable thing, this permanent thing, this thing sitting somewhere deep inside and waiting to be discovered, right? But I don't know, right? Sometimes identity feels like more like wet cement, Whatever keeps pressing against it eventually leaves a shape. And that reminds me of something. I knew a guy who started going to the gym, normal story, happens every day. But what was interesting wasn't the muscles, wasn't the abs, wasn't the low body fat, right? It was the way he started talking. That's what caught my attention. At first he say things like, I hope I can stay consistent. Then I'm trying to stay consistent. And then I've been pretty consistent, all right? And then eventually he's saying things like, I don't miss a day, I don't miss workouts, I'm that guy. I'm that I'm one of them ones, right? Notice what happens there, right? This behavior stayed mostly the same. The identity changed. And once the identity changed, everything else got easier, you know, because now skipping the gym wasn't just skipping the gym, it was violating the person he'd been repeatedly becoming, you know, that's powerful, right? Because repetition isn't just building habits, it's building evidence. And after enough evidence, your brain starts rewriting the story of who you are. Your lore gets deeper. That's some real shit. It does this whether you're paying attention or not, right? Which means if repetition can slowly build and discipline, it can slowly build almost anything. And that's where I think people get blindsided, right? That's the kind of what scares me about all of this. Not in a dramatic way, not in like oh my gosh, nothing is real way. Not that, right? I just think people underestimate how much of themselves gets built accidentally. Because if repetition is constantly rebuilding identity, then a lot of what feels natural might just be familiar. That's different, way different, right? Because familiarity feels true. That's the trap. You ever go back to your hometown after being gone for a while? That's always a weird feeling, right? You leave, you change, new apartments, new routine, new people, new goals. And you start thinking, like, yeah, I'm completely I'm a completely different person now, and right? And then you go back home for a few days, 3 days, and suddenly your old habits start loading back in, same reactions, same insecurities, same thought patterns. You start sleeping at weird times again. You start procrastinating again. Start acting like a version of yourself you thought you outgrew. And you're sitting there confused, like, bro, I thought I dealt with this, And maybe you did. Maybe. But repetition has a long memory. That's the thing, rooms have memories. Objects have memory, environments have memory. You sit in the same chair, listen to the same music, talk to the same people. And certain versions of yourself start waking up because not because they're the real you, but because they're the most rehearsed you. You've been that type of person for 18 years, most of your childhood, right? That's different. That might be the whole video, The most rehearsed version of you often feels like the real version of yourself, even when it really isn't, when it truly isn't. And that's why change feels so strange, right? People think location is becoming somebody else. And I don't think that's what it feels like, right? I think it feels like betraying a familiar character. You know what I mean? Like, imagine somebody who spent years doom scrolling for, years, every morning, top of the morning, every lunch break, every night, phone 6 inches from their face every day, you know? The algorithm knows them better than their own cousins, than their own brothers, than their own mothers, right? Then one day they decide they want to read, they want to pick up, you know, 1984 for once, Marcus Aurelius. Like, cool. Sounds simple, but not simple at all because now they're not fighting a habit. They're fighting a version of themselves, a version built through repetition. And that version has seniority. Damn, I can't speak. It has a level above, let's keep it simple. And that's tough because people get frustrated, they're like, why does this feel unnatural? Because it is, right? At first, you're introducing a new repetition into a system built by old ones, Of course it feels weird, of course it feels fake. Every identity starts as a performance before it becomes a personality. That's uncomfortable to admit, but I think it's true. That's why I like Kaneki as an example. I use him for a couple other videos, but he's one of my favorite characters. And not because of the obvious stuff, right? Not because he's strong, not because he's tortured. Everybody talks about that. I'm talking about adaptation. He's basically somebody who keeps getting rebuilt by what he survives, right? One environment creates one version, then another environment creates another, then another, right? And eventually it becomes hard to separate the person from repetitions that shaped him. That's real. People do that all the time. The only difference is ours usually happens slower, right? Through routines, through playlists, through group chats, through apartments, through timelines, right? Through whatever we keep returning to. That's why I don't fully trust when people say this is who I am. Maybe it is. But I always wonder how much of that is personality and how much of that is repetition through what got grandfathered into you, right? Because after enough time, the line gets blurry. The habit becomes the preference becomes the identity becomes the story, and then the story starts defending itself, right? That's why that's why people get uncomfortable when they change. Not because they're losing themselves, because they're losing a narrative that felt familiar, you know, even if it wasn't helping them. And honestly, I think most people are way more moldable than they realize, not weak, not not soft, but moldable. Human beings absorb, we mirror, we adapt, we rehearse. That's what we do. You know? The problem isn't that repetition shapes people. The problem is most people never notice what they're repeating. And if you don't notice, you end up becoming whatever has the most access to you, the people around you, the media around you, the routines around you, the conversations around you, the algorithm around you, right? Whatever gets the most repetitions wins. That's the scary part. Not because something is controlling you, but because most of the time nothing is. It's just accumulation. Tiny things repeated for years until they've become invisible. And maybe that's why identity feels so mysterious sometimes, because people keep looking for themselves in big moments, relevations, relevations, big breakthroughs, big life decisions. When the answer might be hiding somewhere much smaller, in the songs you keep replaying, the conversations you keep having, the apps you keep opening, the rooms you keep returning to, the thoughts you keep practicing over and over and over again, right? Until one day they stop feeling like habits and start feeling like you. And maybe that's fine. Maybe that's how it's always worked. I don't know. But if repetition can quietly build a person, then it can probably quietly build a stranger too. And the strange thing is, most strangers don't arrive all at once. They've arrived one ordinary day at a time until eventually you wake up and realize you've been practicing somebody for years.